I never imagined a morning could feel like a verdict, the kind you only see in retrospect, the way sunlight spills across your kitchen counter and suddenly casts every familiar object in the wrong shape. But that was the day I realized something fundamental about myself, something I hadn't been ready to name. I was standing at the sink, rinsing the coffee mug I had already filled twice that morning, watching the steam curl into the light, when I felt it, a deep, unshakable shift that seemed to start behind my ribs and settle into the hollow between my shoulders. I couldn't explain it, and at the time, I wouldn't have tried. My name is Daniel, or at least it had been for the 32 years I had inhabited this skin. I live with Claire, my wife of 6 years, who is the kind of person people think of as steady but whose steadiness I now understand to be a form of courage. She teaches high school literature, and she loves words the way other people love air or music. She notices everything, and nothing escapes the careful gaze behind her glasses. Our life together had been quiet, comfortable in a way that felt safe, but underneath that comfort there was always an undercurrent of unspoken questions, the kind that arrive when you ask yourself if you are truly being honest with the person in the mirror, or with anyone else at all. I was a software engineer, which means my days were a series of invisible routines, coding, debugging, attending meetings where the words blurred together like rain on a window, and coming home to the same dinner ritual, the same predictable laughter that had become both balm and ballast. I liked certainty. I liked predictability. And yet, I had always carried, somewhere behind the surface, a quiet fascination with things I couldn't quite own: clothing, presentation, a way of moving through the world that felt not wrong but inexplicably, impossibly, other. Claire didn't know this part of me. I didn't know if I wanted her to. I told myself it wasn't important, that it was a curiosity like any other, a passing fancy I could tuck away into the corner of my mind alongside old hobbies and forgotten ambitions. But the truth, as I would eventually see, is that curiosity was never casual. It was a finger tracing the outlines of a door I had been too scared to open. The first inkling that I might step through that door came not from some dramatic event but from a small, accidental moment. One rainy afternoon, I found myself rifling through a drawer in the back of our closet, looking for a scarf Claire had claimed she'd misplaced months ago. My hand brushed against soft fabric, smooth and unfamiliar, and I froze. It was a blouse, light blue, patterned with tiny white flowers, silk enough that it made a faint whisper when I touched it. My fingers lingered, tracing the curve of the sleeve as if memorizing it through touch alone. I wasn't planning to try it on, and yet, somewhere in the knot of nerves and excitement in my chest, I knew I would. That night, after Claire had gone to bed, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in our bedroom, the blouse in my hands. My reflection looked the same as always, my hair sticking up in the careless way I hated, my jaw set too square, my shoulders broad and unyielding. And then I put it on. The sensation was subtle at first, a mere brushing of fabric against skin, but it quickly spread into something more insistent than I had ever experienced. I felt exposed in a way that was terrifying, yet I also felt recognized. My reflection seemed to shift beneath my gaze, not in shape but in essence. For the first time, I didn't just see myself, I felt myself differently, the way someone might feel sunlight on a part of the body that had always been in shadow. From that night, the small acts multiplied. Socks, scarves, the occasional borrowed piece of Claire's clothing. I moved carefully, hiding this private exploration behind the routines of my life. I was meticulous about the timing, about the way the house smelled, about the way my movements didn't betray me. And all the while, I carried a mix of exhilaration and guilt, a sense that what I was doing was intimate and secret, yet utterly inevitable. It was during one of these quiet evenings, months later, that Claire walked in unexpectedly. I was standing in the bedroom, mid-transition, my hair pinned back in a way that softened the sharpness of my jaw, the blouse slipping slightly over my shoulders. I froze, caught entirely, like an animal caught in the headlights of its own curiosity. She didn't react with anger, or judgment, or laughter. She just looked. And in that look, I felt both seen and exposed. Her silence was neither condemnation nor acceptance, but a careful observation, a weighing of the person she loved against the person I was beginning to become. And in that moment, I realized something: this journey was never about hiding, it was about understanding. Not only myself, but the fragile, complicated world of relationships I had built around me. That realization was not sudden, but gradual, like a tide creeping over sand. From then on, my days became a careful negotiation between outward normalcy and inward exploration. Every glance in a store window, every adjustment of my posture, every thought I allowed myself about who I could be, they were acts of both courage and fear. I learned, slowly, that identity is not a destination but a series of conversations, most of them internal, many of them silent, all of them demanding honesty. I began to journal, not for publication or validation, but for understanding. I wrote about the fear, the wonder, the way my body felt like a borrowed space and yet somehow home. I wrote about the moral dilemmas, what it meant to explore this without deception, how to honor the trust between Claire and me, how to balance curiosity with responsibility. And in writing, I discovered clarity I could not have found otherwise. I realized that transformation, at least the kind that matters, isn't primarily about the body. It's about perception, how we see ourselves, how we imagine others see us, and how those perceptions ripple outward, affecting relationships, decisions, and even the small ethical choices we make every day. My physical appearance would shift over time, certainly, but the larger evolution, the one that would define me, was in empathy, in accountability, in willingness to confront discomfort without running from it. By the time I felt ready to admit, even privately, that I might want to live more openly in this expression, I had already begun to understand that the journey would be both intimate and public, joyous and painful, simple and morally complex all at once. It would require reflection, negotiation, and above all, patience. And that, I knew with an almost sacred certainty, was what would make it worth pursuing, not the novelty of change, but the depth of understanding it offered. Looking back, I see that first night with the blouse as a hinge, a quiet turning point. The choice to try it on wasn't dramatic or impulsive. It was small, deliberate, an act of curiosity that carried with it the seeds of empathy and self-knowledge. And as I stood there in the mirror, unsure of what I would become, I realized that transformation is never a spectacle, it's a conversation. And it is in that conversation, with oneself and with the people we love, that real change takes root. The morning after Claire had caught me, the world seemed unnervingly quiet, as if it were waiting for my confession or my retreat. I didn't know which I would give it first. Breakfast felt like a ritual I had once taken for granted, the scrape of the spoon against the cereal bowl, the hum of the coffee maker, the faint smell of toast. Everything was ordinary, yet nothing was. I moved slowly, feeling the weight of my own hesitation, wondering if the universe had conspired to make me confront the life I had been living with one small, accidental act. Claire sat across from me at the small kitchen table. Her posture was deliberate, composed, and unhurried. She sipped her coffee in silence, eyes tracing the surface of her cup as if she were measuring the heat against her patience. I wanted to speak. I wanted to explain, to apologize, to confess, but the words lodged somewhere between fear and curiosity, a knot I couldn't untangle. Instead, I watched her, trying to read the cadence of her thoughts, the subtle tension in her shoulders. Finally, she said, "Do you want to tell me?" The words weren't sharp, weren't accusing, they were just there, suspended in the morning air, waiting. I realized then that this was a test of honesty, not of courage. She didn't want spectacle, she wanted understanding. I nodded slowly, and the sentences tumbled out before I could shape them, halting and fumbling, each one a mixture of truth, fear, and wonder. I spoke about the blouse, about the small, private moments that had grown into curiosity and self-reflection. I spoke about the feeling of recognition I had seen in the mirror, the way my body, my posture, my voice even felt different when I allowed myself these expressions. And I spoke about the guilt, the fear of deceiving her, of upsetting the life we had built together. Claire listened in silence, her gaze never wavering, but her eyes softened in places that made me almost, but not quite, believe I could be safe. When I finished, she set her cup down and leaned back. "I see," she said quietly, and it was enough for a moment. Enough to breathe, enough to know that she was thinking, enough to realize that she was trying to understand rather than judge. From that day forward, our lives entered a careful negotiation. I didn't expect her to instantly accept everything I wanted to explore, and she didn't. But we began to talk more openly, first in hesitant sentences, then in longer conversations that stretched into evenings, cups of tea cooling beside us while the world outside carried on without pause. I learned about her fears, the worry that I was lonely, that I was hiding something more profound than curiosity, that I might lose myself in a world she didn't fully understand. And she learned about mine, the fear that I had spent too many years ignoring an essential part of myself, that every day I postponed exploration was a day I denied my own growth. It was during these conversations that I started experimenting more deliberately. Not just with clothing, but with posture, gestures, and the cadence of my own voice. I began to notice the subtleties of movement I had never paid attention to, the tilt of my head when I listened, the way my hands rested when I was relaxed, the way my shoulders carried tension or relief. Each adjustment was small, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly affecting how I experienced myself. I wasn't changing for anyone else, I was learning to inhabit my own presence more fully. Socially, the changes were quiet, almost invisible. At work, I became more aware of my interactions, the way colleagues perceived authority, confidence, and authenticity. I realized that much of what I had thought of as personality was performative, learned behaviors meant to conform rather than express. The same was true in friendships. I started to see how much we all perform, how much of social acceptance relies on subtle cues, assumptions, and patterns of expectation. It was fascinating and humbling to see myself as both participant and observer in this intricate dance. At home, the transformation continued more openly, though cautiously. Claire and I experimented together in ways that were both playful and serious, picking out clothes, trying new hairstyles, adjusting makeup for experimentation rather than performance. These moments became a kind of shared language, a way of expressing trust and empathy that didn't require explanation. Each act of dressing, each new choice, was accompanied by reflection. How do I feel in this body? How do I feel being seen? How do I want to navigate the world from this place of self-awareness? But there was tension, too. Moments of doubt crept in, often when I least expected them. I would stand in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection, and a familiar panic would rise. Am I doing this for myself or to fill some imagined expectation? Am I betraying the man I once was, or is this merely an evolution? Sometimes the answer wasn't comforting. Sometimes it was a reminder that transformation isn't linear, isn't clean, and often comes with moral and emotional weight. I began keeping a private journal during these times. The pages became a sanctuary for thoughts I couldn't yet speak aloud, a place to map the interior landscape of fear, curiosity, and self-discovery. I wrote about the small victories, moments when a gesture or posture felt authentically mine, when I caught myself moving through the world with a sense of alignment I had never known. I also wrote about failure, the times I felt like I had overstepped, hurt someone inadvertently, or simply misunderstood myself. One of the most challenging realizations was how much this journey required accountability, not just to myself, but to others. I thought about Claire constantly, about the quiet courage it took for her to witness without judgment, and I understood that self-expression exists in a moral and social context. The choices we make affect the people around us, even when our intentions are innocent. There were nights when I lay awake, turning over hypothetical scenarios, rehearsing conversations I might never have, weighing honesty against fear, integrity against convenience. And through it all, I understood something profound. Identity isn't just self-perception, it's relational, ethical, and inescapably social. Gradually, I noticed changes not just in how I carried myself, but in how I thought, how I felt, how I perceived the world. Empathy deepened. Patience became a conscious practice. I became aware of the ways society pressures us into rigid categories, the assumptions we make about others, the subtle judgments that can both harm and guide. It was humbling to see how easily I had internalized norms that never truly reflected my inner reality, and how liberating it was to question them without fear of spectacle or ridicule. The transformation was not always dramatic, but it was relentless. I started noticing my reflection in the world in ways I never had, how light fell across my face, how clothes draped differently over new contours, how people responded not only to my appearance but to the subtle shifts in my confidence and awareness. Each day offered small lessons, in patience, in observation, in ethical discernment. I realized that my body was not a costume to be worn and removed, it was a canvas for understanding myself, my relationships, and the social currents that shape our lives. And yet, for all the reflection, for all the quiet triumphs, there was still fear. Fear of misunderstanding, fear of rejection, fear of making a misstep that could unravel months of trust and negotiation. Sometimes I would walk through the grocery store, arms wrapped around my cardigan, and feel the weight of invisible eyes, the imagined commentary of strangers. But alongside fear, there was exhilaration, the joy of inhabiting myself more fully, the thrill of aligning internal identity with external presentation, the satisfaction of honoring curiosity with integrity. I understood then that transformation is never about speed or spectacle. It's a practice of awareness, empathy, and courage. Each day, each decision, each reflection mattered. The real change wasn't just in the fabric of clothes I wore, or the softening of my gestures, or even the subtle shifts in appearance. It was in how I saw myself, how I carried responsibility for my choices, and how I engaged with the people I loved. It was ethical, emotional, and profoundly human. Looking back now, I see that period as a crucible, a time when ordinary life collided with self-discovery. The moments were small, often imperceptible, yet they accumulated into a profound evolution. I learned that curiosity must be tempered with responsibility, that identity is both personal and relational, and that the courage to explore oneself honestly is inseparable from the courage to honor the impact of that exploration on others. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that transformation is not a destination, it is a practice, a conversation, and above all, an ethical commitment to living with awareness, empathy, and integrity. It was months before I dared to venture outside in any form that felt unfamiliar to me. I had settled into a private rhythm at home, where Claire and I had created a space of tentative trust and exploration, yet the outside world loomed like a quiet, omnipresent challenge. Every trip beyond our apartment, grocery stores, cafes, even the small park down the street, felt like a negotiation with invisible boundaries. I wasn't just stepping into public space, I was stepping into judgment, expectation, assumption, and potential misunderstanding. The first time I went out fully dressed in a way that reflected my internal sense of self, I remember the sensation as physical as it was emotional. My chest tightened not from anxiety alone but from awareness, every movement measured, every glance a question mark suspended in the air. The cardigan I had chosen felt soft, almost protective, a buffer between curiosity and exposure. My hair, pinned carefully, framed my face differently, not dramatically, but in a way that allowed me to see myself anew in the reflection of windows and mirrors I passed. People noticed, of course, not overtly, not necessarily with any hostility, but the small things, a glance that lingered, a question in the tone of casual conversation, the subtle shifts in body language that tell you more than words ever could. And each moment was a lesson in empathy and awareness. I realized how much of social interaction relies on assumptions, how often we unconsciously categorize people before we even listen. I saw my own assumptions reflected back at me, old habits of thought about identity, presentation, and the limitations of what normal meant. Friends were a different challenge altogether. I started slowly, testing the waters with casual mentions of curiosity and exploration. Some were receptive, their interest genuine, their questions careful. Others were uncomfortable, awkward, uncertain how to respond. I learned to navigate these interactions with patience and honesty, answering questions I felt prepared to answer, deflecting ones that didn't feel necessary, and always being aware of the impact my disclosure might have. These were small acts, yet profoundly educational. I saw my identity reflected in the reactions of others, and in turn, I became more aware of the responsibility inherent in living authentically. Claire's support remained the anchor. There were times when she seemed uneasy, when I could see the careful weighing of curiosity against social expectation in her eyes. We would talk late at night, sometimes for hours, about the ethics of presentation, the nature of identity, the subtle judgments that people project onto each other. I learned that love, in its most disciplined form, involves negotiation and moral awareness, not coercion, not blind acceptance, but careful listening and thoughtful response. And through these conversations, I began to see how my choices ripple outward, affecting the people I care about as much as they affect myself. At work, the stakes felt different. The office environment, with its unspoken rules and routines, was both constraining and illuminating. I experimented cautiously, subtle adjustments to clothing, posture, and tone, and observed reactions with meticulous attention. I realized that confidence, authenticity, and perception are deeply intertwined. How I carried myself influenced how colleagues interacted with me, just as much as the words I spoke. These lessons were both empowering and sobering. Identity is not only personal but profoundly social, and navigating the tension between self-expression and social expectation requires constant awareness. Family interactions presented another layer of complexity. I had not yet disclosed the depth of my exploration to my parents or siblings, and the thought of doing so was both frightening and inevitable. I imagined their faces, their questions, the ways they might misunderstand or judge. I rehearsed conversations endlessly in my mind, trying to anticipate every response, every emotion. It was exhausting, yet necessary. I knew that true honesty could not exist without facing the consequences, and that moral responsibility involves courage as much as insight. Through all of this, I began to notice a subtle shift within myself. I became more patient, not just with others, but with my own internal conflicts. I observed the patterns of fear, curiosity, and hesitation that had once dominated my life and realized that they were not weaknesses but opportunities for growth. I practiced self-compassion, allowing myself to make mistakes without judgment, understanding that identity is a fluid process rather than a fixed endpoint. Perhaps the most profound lesson came in quiet, unassuming moments, walking through the park in late afternoon, feeling the uneven light on my face, laughing with Claire over something trivial yet intimate, noticing the way a friend adjusted their body unconsciously in response to my presence. These moments carried more weight than any dramatic revelation because they were real, lived, and human. They reminded me that identity is inseparable from experience, that transformation is as much about awareness and empathy as it is about appearance. I also encountered discomfort of moments when people misread me, when assumptions became evident, when I felt exposed or vulnerable. These experiences were difficult, yet they were invaluable. I learned to respond with patience and clarity, to correct misunderstandings without defensiveness, and to recognize that discomfort is often a mirror reflecting both our own assumptions and those of others. I became conscious that every interaction is an ethical choice, every word and gesture a potential opportunity to educate, connect, or mislead. Internally, I wrestled with the tension between authenticity and social expectation. I asked myself repeatedly, am I doing this for me, or to fit an ideal I've constructed in my mind? Am I honoring my own curiosity without causing harm? And always, the answer returned to responsibility to myself, to Claire, to friends, colleagues, and family. Identity is not a solitary endeavor, it exists in a web of relationships and moral obligations. In these months, I also became deeply aware of the psychological dimensions of gender expression, how the smallest choices in presentation can ripple through self-perception, confidence, and interaction. I observed how societal norms influence our understanding of authority, credibility, and approachability. I recognized the layers of privilege and constraint embedded in these norms, and I understood that exploring identity responsibly requires both courage and awareness of context. By the end of this period, I realized that transformation is not a single event or series of outward changes. It is a continuum, an accumulation of choices, reflections, and experiences that gradually align self-perception with outward expression. I had learned to move through the world with both curiosity and responsibility, to inhabit my identity with empathy, to navigate the moral and social landscape with care. Each step, each observation, each conversation built upon the last, creating a mosaic of understanding that was both deeply personal and profoundly relational. And yet, even as I grew in confidence and awareness, I knew the journey was far from over. There were conversations yet to be had, boundaries yet to be tested, fears yet to be confronted. But I also knew that the foundation had been laid: patience, empathy, moral reflection, and the courage to inhabit myself fully. Transformation, I understood, is not about the body alone. It is about perception, ethics, and the painstaking practice of living honestly in relation to oneself and others. The weeks that followed marked a subtle but undeniable shift in my life, a kind of tension that was quiet, persistent, and entirely unrelenting. Even when everything appeared ordinary, coffee mugs in the sink, the soft hum of traffic outside our apartment, Claire reading on the couch, I could feel the undercurrent of anticipation, the sense that the smallest choices might ripple outward in unexpected ways. Identity, I realized, was never just internal, it existed in the delicate lattice of relationships, expectations, and perception. I started to notice it in friends first. casual gatherings that had once been comfortable now carried a new weight. I would consider each interaction, silently calculating how much of myself to reveal, how to navigate curiosity without overexposure. One evening, we had a dinner with old college friends. I had chosen a blouse that felt authentic to me, paired with jeans that grounded the look. My hands were unusually still, my voice quieter but deliberate. I watched them, trying to read the reactions behind smiles and polite conversation. Some seemed oblivious, which was a relief. Others cast glances that lingered too long, and I sensed a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. After the meal, one friend, someone I had always considered perceptive, pulled me aside. "You seem different," she said carefully. Her eyes were gentle but searching. "I don't mean anything judgmental, but, are you exploring something?" I paused, the familiar knot of fear and anticipation rising in my chest. And then, slowly, I nodded. I told her the truth, not every detail, not everything, but enough to communicate honesty. And in her response, I felt the strange alchemy of vulnerability, a mixture of acceptance, surprise, and reflection. I realized that these moments were not about approval, they were about presence, empathy, and the courage to inhabit oneself authentically. Work presented its own labyrinth. I had always thought of the office as neutral, a space of logic and routine, but even here, identity demanded negotiation. A colleague once made a comment about attire that could have been innocent, but I recognized in it a subtle projection of gender norms. I felt the familiar spike of anxiety, the awareness that every decision, every movement, carried social meaning beyond my control. And yet, I also felt a burgeoning sense of agency. I could not change the world, but I could respond with integrity, clarity, and reflection. The act of choosing honesty, even in microcosms, became a kind of quiet rebellion against unexamined assumptions. Family remained the most delicate terrain. My parents were still unaware of the depth of my exploration. Phone calls, visits, casual mentions of new interests or hobbies, all were rehearsed in my mind to avoid disruption, to maintain equilibrium. I loved them deeply, and I knew that honesty would require courage, careful timing, and an awareness of their emotional world. Every imagined scenario carried weight, potential rejection, misunderstanding, discomfort, even anger. Yet, I also understood that withholding truth out of fear was itself a form of moral compromise. The balance between self-expression and relational responsibility was never simple, and I had to learn patience, empathy, and ethical discernment in equal measure. One afternoon, Claire and I went shopping, not just for clothing, but for understanding. She had suggested it, a day to explore choices together, without pressure, without judgment. I remember walking down aisles lined with fabrics and textures, feeling the quiet thrill of curiosity tempered by reflection. I tried on garments, watched my posture in mirrors, listened to Claire's observations, small, careful, compassionate. And as I moved through the store, I noticed how each act, each choice, each glance from strangers carried layers of social meaning. I felt both liberated and exposed. The world responded to me differently now, and I realized that perception is a constant negotiation, a moral and social responsibility as much as a personal journey. Yet even in these moments of insight, doubt persisted. Late at night, I would lie awake and reflect on the choices I had made, the conversations I had avoided, the small acts of concealment or revelation. I wondered, was I being fair to myself? To Claire? To friends, colleagues, and family? Identity is not only about alignment between internal and external selves, it is a moral practice, a negotiation with the world that requires courage, patience, and vigilance. I realized that transformation is inseparable from accountability, and that every decision carries weight beyond the personal sphere. The psychological dimension of this journey was as complex as the social one. I became acutely aware of the ways internalized norms shape self-perception, the subtle ways fear and desire intertwine, and the intricate patterns of curiosity and self-judgment. There were moments of profound revelation, standing alone in the apartment, feeling fully recognized by my reflection, and moments of despair, when the weight of potential misunderstanding felt unbearable. Yet, each moment, each reflection, each ethical consideration brought me closer to clarity. I understood that identity is never fixed, never static, it is a continuous practice of observation, reflection, and negotiation. Even Claire, the steady anchor in this evolving life, faced moments of doubt. She would voice concerns quietly, with care, about exposure, about public perception, about the ripple effects of my choices on our relationship. And each time, I listened, reflected, and considered, not defensively, not dismissively, but with deliberate empathy. I realized that transformation is as much relational as it is personal. The courage to inhabit oneself must coexist with responsibility to the people who love and trust us. One evening, a confrontation with a stranger crystallized the complexity of public perception. I had stopped at a cafe, dressed in a blouse that felt authentically mine, hair arranged to frame my face in a way that felt comfortable and natural. A man behind the counter looked at me, paused, and then made a comment, something casual, yet laden with assumption. About my appearance. My heart raced, the familiar spike of anxiety rising. And yet, instead of retreating, I responded calmly, with a measured, honest acknowledgement of my identity. The exchange was brief, unremarkable to anyone else, but to me, it was a small but significant assertion of agency, the conscious choice to exist openly, ethically, and without apology. Through experiences like these, I began to see the subtle architecture of social norms, the assumptions that govern perception, and the moral responsibility inherent in navigating them. Identity is not merely personal, it is ethical, relational, and social. Each choice carries consequences, and awareness of those consequences is inseparable from the practice of authentic selfhood. By the end of this period, I realized that transformation had become more than curiosity or experimentation. It was a deliberate engagement with the world, a practice of empathy, moral discernment, and relational accountability. I had learned to move through space with awareness, to respond to misunderstanding with patience, to balance curiosity with responsibility. The journey was neither linear nor simple, but it was profoundly human. I was discovering not just who I could be, but who I ought to be in relation to the people I love, the communities I inhabit, and the ethical framework I wish to uphold. And even as I reflected on these lessons, I understood that the most challenging moments were still ahead, conversations yet to be had, assumptions yet to be challenged, internal fears yet to be confronted. But I faced them with the knowledge that transformation is never solitary, it is relational, ethical, and ongoing. It is a conversation with oneself, with loved ones, and with the world, a practice that requires patience, courage, and above all, integrity. The slow accumulation of months had a way of reshaping not only how I saw myself, but how I understood the texture of the world. I began to notice that every choice, every gesture, every word, every subtle adjustment of posture or tone, was part of a larger conversation with existence itself. Transformation, I realized, was not only about aligning appearance with self-perception, but about reconciling the moral, relational, and social dimensions of that alignment. It was exhausting, humbling, exhilarating, and profoundly human all at once. Claire remained the axis around which this delicate balance rotated. Some days, she was quietly radiant, patient and attentive in ways that I could only describe as heroic. She would watch me, occasionally offering advice or suggestions, not as critique, but as collaboration. The way she listened without judgment, the way she allowed silence to occupy the space between us when words were unnecessary, taught me more about empathy than any book or lecture ever could. And some nights, when I sensed her worry about the world's perception of me, I felt the weight of responsibility press down like a tangible thing in my chest. Not because I feared judgment alone, but because I loved her and understood that my exploration could ripple outward, touching her life in ways I could not fully control. It was in these moments of reflection that I began to explore identity not just as a personal truth, but as a relational ethic. To be authentic meant not only being honest with myself, but navigating the consequences of that honesty in the lives of those I cared about. I began to see the small, often invisible ways our choices affect one another, the careful timing of revelations, the balancing of curiosity and disclosure, the quiet negotiation of boundaries. It was humbling to realize that living authentically requires patience, vigilance, and above all, an awareness of interconnectedness. Public spaces remained a crucible. Walking down a crowded street, entering a cafe, sitting in a park, every glance felt like a potential moral test. I noticed the assumptions people projected onto me, Glances that lingered too long, subtle shifts in posture, the unspoken calculations that everyone seems to make when they categorize someone as different. And yet, I found empowerment in observation. I could not control perception, but I could respond with integrity, patience, and clarity. Every small interaction became a lesson in ethics as much as in courage. I learned to recognize microaggressions, to navigate misunderstanding, and to engage with the world without defensiveness. Friendships began to evolve in ways I had not anticipated. Some friends withdrew slightly, uncertain how to respond, perhaps afraid of misstepping or misunderstanding. Others leaned in, asking thoughtful questions, observing carefully, offering their own reflections. These dynamics illuminated a fundamental truth: identity is relational. We exist not in isolation, but in a web of perceptions, assumptions, and expectations. Living authentically requires not only self-awareness but empathy and ethical attentiveness to the experiences of others. One afternoon, I received a message from a childhood friend I hadn't spoken to in years. She had heard through mutual acquaintances that I was exploring new aspects of myself. The message was careful, hesitant, yet curious. Would I be willing to talk? I spent hours rehearsing possible responses, imagining every conceivable reaction. Finally, I replied honestly, offering insight into my journey, acknowledging both the fear and the exhilaration, the moral reflections and the ethical considerations. Our subsequent conversation was long, reflective, and, above all, human. I realized that sharing identity with others is not a performance, it is a negotiation, a dialogue in which vulnerability is inseparable from connection. Family remained the most challenging frontier. Conversations with my parents, when they finally began, were tentative and laden with expectation. I spoke carefully, framing my exploration as an ethical and emotional journey rather than a sudden whim. My father, cautious and measured, asked questions that betrayed both concern and curiosity. My mother, ever attuned to nuance, listened quietly, absorbing the layers of fear, reflection, and courage I had carried for so long. These exchanges were uncomfortable at times, yet profoundly educational. I saw firsthand the interplay between identity, morality, and social expectation, and I learned to navigate it with patience, empathy, and honesty. At home, the quiet rituals of shared life deepened in meaning. Claire and I established a new rhythm of collaboration, selecting clothing, experimenting with gestures, refining posture, practicing speech patterns that felt authentic. These were not acts of vanity or performance, but exercises in awareness, mindfulness, and self-understanding. Each act, no matter how small, became a meditation on identity, responsibility, and relational integrity. I began to notice the subtle joy that comes from inhabiting oneself fully, not as spectacle, but as a deliberate, conscious practice. Work, too, became a laboratory for ethical practice. Subtle adjustments to attire, voice, and demeanor revealed patterns of perception I had never considered. I noticed how colleagues unconsciously assigned authority, credibility, and likability based on appearance, and I learned to navigate these norms without compromising authenticity. The ethical challenge was constant: to inhabit myself fully while respecting social expectations, to assert identity without causing harm, to act with integrity amid assumptions and bias. It was exhausting, yet profoundly instructive. Internally, I wrestled with recurring questions. Was I living authentically, or simply performing a version of self I had idealized? Was I honoring my curiosity responsibly, or indulging in secrecy? Was I accountable to myself, Claire, friends, and family in equal measure? These reflections, sometimes painful, were crucial. They reminded me that transformation is not linear, that moral and emotional growth are inseparable from self-discovery, and that integrity requires constant vigilance. The most profound lessons, however, emerged in moments of quiet observation: the way sunlight fell across my reflection in a shop window, the way Claire's smile lingered with understanding, the subtle shifts in a friend's expression when they saw me fully for the first time. These moments were neither spectacular nor dramatic, yet they carried enormous significance. They were reminders that identity is lived in detail, in relationships, in reflection, and in ethical awareness. By this stage, I recognized a deep emotional integration occurring within myself. The fear that had once dominated every choice had softened, replaced by a deliberate, conscious courage. I learned to embrace vulnerability without shame, to inhabit discomfort without retreat, and to navigate relational complexity without avoidance. Transformation had become a practice of mindfulness, empathy, and ethical attentiveness. And still, the horizon was not static. Challenges remained, difficult conversations, societal assumptions, moments of doubt, unexpected misperceptions. Yet I faced them with growing clarity. Identity is not a spectacle to be performed, it is a responsibility to be navigated thoughtfully, ethically, and empathetically. Transformation is not a destination, but a continuous, relational, morally informed journey. Perhaps the most important realization of all was this: the person I had once thought I was, the comfortable, predictable Daniel, had not disappeared. Instead, he had expanded, integrated, and evolved. The exploration of identity was not a rejection of the past, but an ethical engagement with the present and a conscious preparation for the future. I could be both the Daniel who loved routine and the Daniel who explored freedom, the Daniel who valued stability and the Daniel who embraced curiosity, the Daniel who cherished relationships and the Daniel who honored selfhood. In this integration, I found a profound sense of peace. Not a naive peace, untested by challenge, but a reflective, considered, and morally informed tranquility. I could inhabit my identity without fear, navigate relationships with integrity, and move through the world with deliberate awareness. Each day became an exercise in empathy, ethical judgment, and relational mindfulness. And in these practices, I discovered that the true essence of transformation is not in appearance, not in spectacle, and not in novelty, but in ethical, emotional, and psychological alignment with oneself and others. Time, I realized, is both cruel and kind. It moves relentlessly forward, indifferent to hesitation, fear, or preparation, yet it also allows for the quiet accumulation of insight, the gradual weaving of understanding into the fabric of daily life. By the time I reached the point of fully inhabiting my identity, not as a secret curiosity, not as an experimental indulgence, but as a lived, integrated reality, I could see how far the journey had carried me. It was not dramatic, it was subtle, cumulative, and deeply human. Claire and I had settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary, because our life still revolved around coffee mugs in the sink, conversations about mundane work, and the quiet rituals of shared routines. Extraordinary, because every moment of daily life was now infused with reflection, empathy, and moral attentiveness. I could dress as myself without fear of judgment within the safety of our home, but I could also venture outside, into the world, with awareness of social norms, perception, and the ethical implications of my choices. I had learned that freedom is inseparable from responsibility, and authenticity requires not only courage, but patience, reflection, and relational mindfulness. One evening, as we walked through the park, the air cool with early spring, I noticed how much I had changed, not in some superficial, visible way, but in the texture of thought, perception, and feeling. The way I moved, the subtle alignment of posture, the way I listened and responded to Claire, friends, and even strangers, all of it carried a depth of awareness I had never possessed before. I was no longer simply reacting, I was present, deliberate, and ethically attuned. Transformation, I realized, is as much about perception and moral clarity as it is about identity or appearance. Friends had gradually come to understand, or at least accept, the evolving reality of who I was. Conversations that were once tentative became natural, even easy. I noticed that empathy is often reciprocal. By demonstrating honesty, patience, and moral attentiveness, I invited understanding from others. Misunderstandings still occurred, of course, but I had learned to navigate them without defensiveness. I listened more, judged less, and approached uncertainty with curiosity rather than fear. These were subtle skills, but their accumulation created a profound shift in relational dynamics. Family, too, had begun to navigate their own journey alongside mine. My parents had adjusted, not perfectly, not without moments of tension, but with genuine effort to understand. I realized that authenticity often challenges those we love, and that patience and ethical reflection extend both inward and outward. The difficult conversations, once anticipated with dread, became exercises in moral practice, acknowledging discomfort, offering honesty, and allowing time for understanding. I learned that the responsibility of transformation is relational, and that ethical identity requires attending not only to oneself, but to the people one loves. At work, the changes were more nuanced. Subtle adjustments in posture, voice, and presence had become natural, almost instinctive. I noticed how people responded differently, not only to appearance, but to the quiet confidence that emerges from alignment between self-perception and presentation. Authority, credibility, and empathy are intertwined. I realized they are shaped by perception, yes, but also by the ethical consistency of behavior and the integrity of interactions. Every choice became an opportunity to practice patience, clarity, and conscientiousness. Internally, I had reached a stage of integration that had once seemed impossible. The fear that had driven secrecy, hesitation, and internal conflict had softened into a reflective awareness. I could inhabit myself fully, without apology, without performance, yet with deliberate attention to the moral and social dimensions of each act. I had come to understand that identity is not a solitary project. It exists in relationship, within a moral and social framework, and in dialogue with both internal truth and external consequence. One of the most illuminating realizations was the way transformation reshaped empathy. By inhabiting a space that others often misunderstand, I became acutely aware of the judgments, assumptions, and pressures that shape human experience. I recognized how fragile social perception is, how easily misunderstanding arises, and how essential patience and ethical clarity are in navigating these spaces. The act of self-realization had become, simultaneously, an exercise in moral and social awareness. Claire's presence had evolved alongside mine. We moved through our shared life with new fluidity, a quiet understanding that our love was strengthened not by ignoring difference, but by witnessing, reflecting, and engaging with it ethically. The intimacy of our collaboration, selecting clothing, experimenting with gestures, reflecting on posture and tone, was never about vanity or performance. It was about observation, reflection, and mutual understanding. I could see in her eyes the trust that had deepened, the empathy that had grown, and the respect that had matured alongside our exploration. There were moments, of course, that tested this integration. Misunderstandings in public, microaggressions from colleagues, awkward reactions from friends, or subtle tension from family, all required patience, ethical discernment, and reflection. But even these moments became instructive. Each discomfort was a lesson in relational responsibility, a reminder that identity is inseparable from the ethical landscape it inhabits. Each moment offered an opportunity to respond with clarity, honesty, and empathy, and to practice moral courage in ordinary life. By the time I stood in front of a mirror one evening, reflecting on the months of transformation, I saw not only a physical reflection, but an ethical and emotional one. The journey had never been about novelty, curiosity, or spectacle. It had been about alignment, aligning perception with authenticity, curiosity with responsibility, identity with ethics. I saw the integration of fear, courage, empathy, moral reflection, and relational awareness. I saw the deliberate practice of living honestly, and I recognized the profound human significance of this work. I realized that the essence of transformation is neither dramatic nor performative. It is relational, ethical, and psychological. It is patience, reflection, and courage. It is the recognition that living authentically carries responsibility, to oneself, to loved ones, and to the wider social world. The outward appearance, while important, is secondary to the interior cultivation of moral and emotional integrity. Transformation, at its core, is a practice of conscientious presence. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: identity is never fixed. It is a continuum, a conversation, and a moral responsibility. It is lived in gestures, in decisions, in reflection, in empathy, and in relational awareness. By inhabiting myself fully, I did not abandon the past, I integrated it. I did not escape responsibility, I embraced it. I did not seek approval, I cultivated understanding. I could now move through the world with a quiet, deliberate courage, aware of perception, conscious of ethical responsibility, and present in every relational and social moment. I had learned that the freedom of self-expression is inseparable from reflection, that authenticity is inseparable from empathy, and that transformation is most meaningful when it aligns internal truth with moral awareness and relational responsibility. Looking back, I understood that every blouse tried on in secret, every quiet reflection, every moment of fear, curiosity, and ethical wrestling had accumulated into something profound. Transformation had become a lived practice, not spectacle, not novelty, not rebellion, but the conscientious cultivation of identity, morality, and empathy. And as I left the mirror that evening, stepping into the quiet hum of ordinary life, I felt a deep, ethical satisfaction. Not the thrill of change, but the calm of integration. Not the rush of novelty, but the quiet power of understanding. Not the applause of others, but the deliberate, conscientious presence of self, fully inhabited, fully accountable, and fully human.